By the summer of 1778, the American War of Independence had settled into a grinding, uncertain rhythm. The early lightning bolts, Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, had given way to long campaigns, shifting alliances, and the slow, stubborn realization that this war could not be won by a single glorious stroke. Washington's army had survived Valley Forge, but only just. The British held New York like a clenched fist. Philadelphia had been taken and then abandoned. The war's momentum seemed to sway like a lantern in a storm, never quite steady, never quite secure. Then came the news that changed everything. France had entered the war. For the first time, the Americans had a powerful ally with ships, soldiers, money, and the promise of a global conflict that could stretch British resources thin. Washington knew the moment was fragile. The French alliance was new, untested, and politically delicate. The first joint operation between the two nations needed to succeed. It needed to show the world that the American cause was not a rebellion, but a revolution with international legitimacy. And the place where that test would come was Rhode Island. Rhode Island had been under British occupation since December 1776. Newport, once a thriving port, a jewel of the Atlantic trade, had become a garrison town. British redcoats and Hessian auxiliaries patrolled its narrow streets. Loyalist refugees crowded its wharves. Farms on Aquidneck Island were stripped bare to feed the occupying army. The people of that island lived under a constant grinding pressure, their livelihoods drained, their loyalties tested, their future uncertain. But resistance simmered. It simmered in the Maori Tavern in Providence, shown here, in the farmhouses of Tiverton, and in the marshes and coves where small boats slipped across the bay under moonlight. No one embodied that simmering defiance more than Colonel William Barton. Barton had already carved his name into the war's story with the daring nighttime capture of British General Richard Prescott. That raid, discussed previously here on Roadways, launched from the quiet shores of Tiverton, had humiliated the British and electrified the Patriot cause. Barton had become a symbol of Rhode Island's stubborn refusal to bow, and though Prescott was gone, exchanged for Charles Lee, Barton remained. He was restless, ambitious, and fiercely loyal to his home state. He wanted the British out of Rhode Island, and he wanted to be part of the effort to achieve that. As 1778 dawned, Barton found himself increasingly involved in the preparations for what would become the largest military operation in Rhode Island's history. He scouted the shores. He met with General in Charge John Sullivan. He coordinated with local militia leaders. He helped gather intelligence on British fortifications. And he watched, with a mixture of hope and impatience, as the French fleet under Admiral d'Estaing sailed towards Narragansett Bay. The stage was set. The French were coming. The Americans were gathering. And Barton, Rhode Island's own midnight raider, was ready to help deliver the blow that might finally free his state. But war has a way of twisting even the best laid plans, and the battle that was coming would test every man who stepped onto the fields of Aquidneck Island. The campaign began with promise. D'Estaing's fleet arrived off Newport in late July, its great ships of the line casting long shadows across the water. Sullivan's American forces, Continental Regulars, militia from New England, and the remarkable 1st Rhode Island Regiment, they all assembled in Tiverton and Bristol. Barton moved among them, advising, encouraging, and preparing for the assault he had long dreamed of. The plan was simple in theory. The French would enter Narragansett Bay and trap the British fleet, while Sullivan's army crossed onto Aquidneck Island and advanced on Newport from the north. With the British isolated and outnumbered, the combined Franco-American Army and Navy would force their surrender. But the British were not idle. They scuttled ships to block the channel. They strengthened their redoubts. They prepared fallback lines, and they watched the horizon with growing anxiety. Then came the storm. A massive hurricane swept up the coast, just as the French and British fleets maneuvered for position. The winds tore sails to ribbons. Masts snapped like twigs. Ships were scattered across the ocean. When the storm finally passed, both fleets were battered, but the French, already cautious about risking their ships in the narrow bay, decided to withdraw to Boston for repairs, as shown here, with a line of battleship trailing her damaged mizzenmast. The Americans were stunned. Sullivan was furious. Barton, who had placed such hope in the French alliance, felt the blow keenly. But the campaign could not simply be abandoned. Sullivan pressed forward, determined to strike the British before they realized how weakened the Americans truly were. The morning of August 29th, 1778, broke with a heavy stillness, the kind that seems to hold its breath before history shifts. 11,000 militia and Continentals cross from Tiverton to Aquidneck Island at Howland's Ferry. Mist clung to the fields and stone walls of the island, and the dew on the tall grass shimmered like a thin coat of frost. Then, from the south, came the first distant thump of British cannon. It was a low, rolling sound that made the earth itself seem tense. The British fleet had moved into position during the night. Frigates and smaller vessels crept along the western shore of the island, their gun ports yawning open like rows of black, hungry eyes. As Sullivan's army formed its lines, the ships began to fire, their broadsides sending plumes of white smoke drifting across the bay. The cannonballs hissed overhead, smashing into orchards, tearing through fences, and showering the Continental positions with splinters of earth and wood. Soldiers later recalled the eerie whistle of the incoming rounds, followed by the sudden, violent crash that sent men diving for cover. One Rhode Island militiaman wrote that the British ships seemed to breathe fire, their guns flashing in rhythmic pulses, as if the vessels themselves were alive and enraged. The bombardment didn't break the American lines, but it rattled them, and it set the tone for a day that would be defined by noise, smoke, and the relentless pressure of an enemy determined to crush the rebellion on Rhode Island soil. As the naval guns roared from the west, the British and Hessian infantry advanced from the south. The first major clash erupted near Quaker Hill, where General Nathaniel Greene's Continentals braced themselves behind hastily built earthworks. The Hessians came on in tight formation, their bayonets glinting in the morning light. Greene's men waited until the enemy was close, painfully close, before unleashing a volley that tore into the front ranks. The Hessians staggered, regrouped, and charged again. In the chaos of that fight, individual acts of courage flickered like sparks in a storm. Captain Silas Talbot, later famous as a naval officer, led a small detachment that held a crumbling stone wall against repeated Hessian assaults. At one point, when his men began to waver, Talbot climbed atop the wall itself, standing fully exposed, and shouted for them to hold. Musket balls snapped by him like angry hornets, but he didn't flinch. His men steadied. The line held. Not far away, a young Continental drummer named Benjamin Pierce, father of future President Franklin Pierce, refused to leave the field, even after a cannonball shattered the ground beside him, knocking him flat. Dazed, ears ringing, he scrambled back to his feet and resumed beating the cadence that kept his regiment moving in good order. Officers later said that Pierce's steady rhythm helped prevent a full retreat during one of the Hessians' fiercest pushes. To the west, the 1st Rhode Island Regiment faced its own trial by fire. These men, many of them formerly enslaved, all of them volunteers, stood behind a low rise near Butts Hill as Hessian grenadiers advanced towards them. The grenadiers were elite troops, tall, disciplined, and terrifying in their precision. They expected the Rhode Islanders to break without a fight. They did not. The 1st Rhode Island fired in controlled, deliberate volleys, each one cutting into the advancing line. When the Hessians closed to within bayonet range, the Rhode Islanders met them with a ferocity that stunned even veteran officers. One soldier, a man known in the records only as Prince, fought with such determination that his comrades later swore he seemed to be everywhere at once, loading, firing, shouting warnings, dragging wounded men to safety, then returning to the line without hesitation. A Hessian officer later wrote that the regiment fought with a valor equal to any troops in the world. Throughout the day, Colonel William Barton moved along the American lines like a man with fire in his veins. He carried messages between Greene and Sullivan, directed militia units that were in danger of collapsing, and personally led a small counterattack to plug a gap near the eastern flank. Soldiers who saw him remembered his intensity, the way he seemed to know instinctively where the danger was greatest, and how he appeared at those places just when he was needed most. At one point, during a lull in the fighting, Barton paused near a battery that had been trading fire with the British ships. The gunners were exhausted, their faces blackened with powder, their shirts soaked with sweat. Barton clapped one of them on the shoulder and said, "Give them another round for Rhode Island." The gunner grinned, touched the linstock to the vent, and sent a round screaming toward a British sloop that had been harassing the American flank. The shot struck the water just short of the ship, sending up a towering plume of spray that drenched the deck and momentarily silenced its guns. The Americans cheered. The battle raged for hours. Cannon smoke drifted across the fields. Musket fire crackled through orchards and stone walls. The sun climbed high, beating down on exhausted soldiers. And slowly, painfully, the Americans began to pull back toward their northern defenses. By late afternoon, both sides were spent. The British had failed to break the American lines. The Americans had failed to drive the British back to Newport. It was, at the end of that day, a bloody stalemate. But the Americans could not stay. Without the French fleet, their position was untenable. That night, Sullivan ordered a withdrawal across Howland's Ferry. Barton helped oversee the retreat, ensuring that Rhode Island soldiers, his neighbors, his friends, made it safely back to the mainland. The Battle of Rhode Island was over. The immediate aftermath was a mixture of frustration and pride. The Americans had not taken Newport. The British remained entrenched, and the grand Franco-American operation had collapsed before it truly began. The Battle of Rhode Island did not decide the war, but it shaped the war's trajectory in ways that historians still trace today. It proved that American and French forces could coordinate on a large scale, even if the first attempt faltered. It demonstrated the resilience of the Continental Army after years of hardship. It showcased the bravery of the 1st Rhode Island's black soldiers in a way that would echo through future generations. And it marked Rhode Island as a place where the Revolution's ideals, liberty, equality, self-determination, were tested not just in speeches, but in blood. When the British finally evacuated Newport in 1779, they did so not because of a single battle, but because the cumulative pressure of the war and the threat of a renewed Franco-American cooperation made their position untenable. Rhode Island was free again. As for Barton, his legacy remained tied to the state he loved. His capture of Prescott became legend. His role in the 1778 campaign, though less celebrated, was no less vital. He had been there in the planning, in the fighting, and in the retreat. He had stood with Rhode Island when it mattered most. And in telling this story, our story, Rhode Island's story, you keep his memory alive. Thanks for watching Roadways. Please let us know what you think and what you'd like to see more of in the comments below.